Welcome back, everyone, to episode 7 of the iProgress podcast. I'm your host, Dean, and as always, I'm joined by Craig. And today we're going to be looking at the things that we would change in academia. So between the two of us, we've had around about 20 years of academic experience. And although these are things that we would change, and they're our own kind of personal opinions, they are fueled by experiences and also discussions with other academics across lots of universities within the UK and wider afield. So the first thing we're going to kick off with is the clarity of promotion pathways. Now, this is something which starts to dawn on us as early career academics in our second, third year of being in the job, whereby we're looking to see how we can not so much fast track our career into becoming a senior lecturer, but to at least know what are the skills and experiences that we need to be picking up along the way. I think one of the main things, and this harkens back to one of our previous podcasts in terms of mental well-being and trying to not overburden ourselves as early career academics, we don't always know what boxes we need to tick. And because of that, we start to do everything we can in terms of research, wider scholarship, teaching, training, consultancy. And just because we want to have all of those skills in place when we do apply for our senior lectureship and hopefully further down the line, our associate professorship. So, Craig, what are your experiences in terms of you being able to navigate these promotional pathways?
There's been a few, really. So as you know, and as listeners might know, I've recently gone through the kind of promotion process, and I've recently been kind of promoted to associate professor. So kind of I know kind of roughly what is being looked for in these kind of searches for promotion. My experience tells me that things like research output is important. Things like grant capture, so bringing in research funding, is important. Trying to develop a sense of impact. So how is your work being used in different areas, different sectors? Is it changing policy in different places? But equally, what's the experience that you're giving students as well in terms of your teaching philosophy, any courses you've developed, any module evaluations that you've had? And we know that there are huge issues with things like module evaluations and teaching evaluations, but these seem to be the things that are kind of highly weighted when it comes to making these kinds of decisions. And I realize that feels like everything about the job. So it's teaching, it's research, it's grant income, it's impact. So yeah, there's lots of things that seem to be playing into that kind of promotion process. But equally, I think some of the stuff that we've discussed in previous episodes is kind of thinking about how do we streamline some of the processes that we have to make sure that you can get good research output alongside good teaching experiences for students. Can you get students involved with different things to give you pilot data that you can use for a grant application that they might be on as well? So there's different things that you can do, I guess, to kind of bring these things all together.
Perfect. And then I think just kind of on top of that, and to encompass everything, we need to make sure that when you're going under kind of supervision and training to take on these higher roles, that the people who are in charge of mentoring you are being as open and transparent as possible to tell you, okay, so in terms of your portfolio, this is enough. Okay, for the next step, this is enough. You're ticking all of the necessary boxes. I've seen so many people who have joined ethics committees, for example, and they've just stayed on those committees for years because they feel that when they need to come to that progression board or that progression meeting, that they need to be on those committees at the time. In some institutions that might be the case, but in other institutions it might not be. In other institutions you might need maybe 6 or 12 months experience, and that's almost enough for you to kind of tick that box. Whereas other universities, actually, when you are ramping up to that promotion pathway, they want to see that you're actively engaged. So it's little things like that. It's the little kind of clarity in terms of what do you need at that particular institution at that particular time, looking for that particular promotion. And I think if that's hidden behind a veil, it can almost be quite impossible for you to be able to navigate that situation.
Yeah, and I think about some of the kind of nuances of the different processes. So I think particularly around kind of associate professorship, that is a designation in higher education that shows that you are established in your role. You're established as a scholar in your area. In the States, that means you have tenure, which is essentially a job for life because you've established yourself in that particular area as a leading researcher, as a leading person. In the UK, there are some universities where it's not just the case that you have to, throughout your career, accumulate this evidence. When you come to apply for promotion, you can use evidence within a very specific time frame. So when I was applying, for example, I could only use evidence from within the last 5 years. So that is, I mean, for me, I've only been in the job for 6 or 7 years. So it wasn't too much of an issue. But if you think about people who are going into the kind of middle stages of their career, if they've been building up evidence over the course of 10 or 15 years, if they then need to only draw on that last 5 years of experience, it might be that you need to be a little bit more strategic, I guess, in terms of where you get your experience, how long you keep doing that experience, but also thinking ahead. So if you want to apply for a promotion in 2 years' time, what is going to potentially come off your application at that point? And how can you start to supplement some of that to make sure that your application is as rounded as it can be? It's a really important kind of trick, I think, in terms of making sure that everything that you need falls into that eligibility window.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's really important. One thing that I've been working with some coachees on in the past is that promotion pathway. And one of the kind of hints and tips that I have that I don't mind sharing with you guys is that instead of just looking towards the next promotion, look for maybe 2 promotions in the future. So if you are a early career academic, don't just be looking at that senior lectureship, but also be looking at that associate prof role. Because if you're doing that, what that allows you to do is then say, okay, so in addition to the senior lectureship activities, these are the additional things that I need to be building into that application. And what that means is that if you are kind of headstrong, you're looking at that senior, if you're looking at that senior lectureship, and another opportunity comes along that perhaps can be useful for the future, it's not something that you instantaneously dismiss, or it's not something that you engage in but don't push it to the maximum and get exactly what you need from. Because all these stories, all of these experiences really do build into your portfolio. But if you're not being guided in terms of, and this goes back to the need for appropriate mentorship, if you're not being guided as to how best to use these experiences, how best to frame these experiences, and also what you need to take from each of those experiences, then ultimately you could have 2 people going for the same job role, both have very similar portfolios, but just because one person has been mentored into how to turn that into a story, which is something that both you and I, Craig, are very kind of keen on, that storytelling. If you can't tell the right story at the right time, then ultimately it's going to favor one party over the next.
Yeah, I agree. And to be honest, one of the best pieces of advice that I had from a previous manager was to frame your yearly objectives in line with what the next band up should be doing.
Yeah, that's excellent.
So, for example, as a lecturer, for example, it might be that you're expected to submit 1 paper per year, maybe 2 papers a year. As a senior lecturer, that might go up to 3 or 4. So can you get to a point where over the first couple of years of your lectureship, you're submitting maybe 2 papers a year, building the capacity so that when you get to just before your promotion application, you're submitting the number of papers that you would need to be a senior lecturer. At that point in your application, it's not you saying, promote me and I will perform at that level. It's you telling the employer, I'm already performing as a senior lecturer. So you should promote me because I'm producing that output that you would expect at that level anyway. Does that make sense? So it's kind of thinking through, how do you show that you're not just able to perform at that level, but that you are performing at that level?
Yeah, I think that's probably the take-home tip for me. And we are going to be doing a podcast in a couple of weeks' time in terms of how to present yourself for those promotions, and also how to present yourself in the job market. So that's something that we might revisit. But of course, if you are going to be doing that expanded research portfolio, what you need, and that brings us on to the second thing that we would change in academia, is to fully protect our research hours. Because one thing that always kind of hinders my diary is that I always try to section off research time. And I know Craig's very passionate about partitioning that off, making sure it's as protected as possible. But I kind of guess as you grow in academia, as you get more kind of leadership responsibilities, more academic roles, more administration roles, what happens is that you can't forego your teaching. You can't forego your student welfare and pastoral care. And so if anything additional comes that impacts your diary, what the first thing that we lose from that is our research time, because it's something that's easy for us to say, well, actually, I can put that off. But if we do want to be hitting this promotion, we do need to start fully protecting the time that we put in our diaries for research time. And for me, that's roughly 1 day a week. I don't know about you, Craig.
Yeah, I try and protect 1 day a week. If I can get two, then I'll do that. But yeah, I tend to have two blocks, at least blocks on 2 days a week. If I need to then take one of those blocks out for admin stuff, then I will. But usually, yeah, it's 1 to 2 days a week.
Yeah, and it can be really important. And I think that when we talk about you get given 1 day for research in a particular role, and I think that's quite common in the UK for your basic lectureship position, unless you're a research fellow, then it might change. But when we do talk about days, we don't just mean 1 full day. Oftentimes, as Craig said, this might be split into 2 or maybe 3 blocks. And I kind of guess that as academics, it's our job to make sure that we're being as productive as we can within those blocks, because there's no point sitting down to do research if we're not in the mood to write. And we've spoken about that in quite a few podcasts now, and also some of our YouTube videos. But the main point is having that ability to protect that time. And I think that if we are being additionally workloaded, it's quite easy for us to forego that time. But if a employer or wider university really wants to push us in our role and they want us to do well, they want to make sure as many staff get to senior positions as possible, then actually they do need to do a little bit more in terms of making sure that time is protected. Now, it might be that they try and envelop that in some sort of activity. So, for example, do we have designated writing retreats within our diary that everybody commits to? Is it something that can be managed a lot closer in terms of that line managerial role? So are your line managers making sure that they're not giving you additional duties which can impact on that research time? Craig, I don't know if there's anything else that you think that you would find beneficial in terms of the wider institutions helping you to protect that time.
Yeah, I mean, institutions kind of hamstrung, I guess, because a lot of the kind of core business of the university is to teach, particularly in the UK, where we don't have that many kind of intensively research oriented institutions. You think about the Oxfords, the Cambridges, the UCLs, the Kings, but you don't they're quite rare, to be honest, in terms of having staff that are specifically there, professors, associate professors that are specifically there to just research. So I think what you said just then was really interesting in terms of having 1 day a week. And most universities will say that you'll have 1 day a week for research. I've not noticed that, to be honest, in terms of workloads. It might be that you get a kind of short block where you have 1 day a week where you're able to do research. It might be that you have other blocks where you just don't have that. And that's something that is just part of the job, unfortunately. But it's about when you do get those times, making sure that you can just get straight into the action of writing and doing research. So stuff that we've spoken about before in terms of making sure that you have templates written, that you have a way of just, when you do have that block, even if it's just an afternoon, you can sit down and you can start working straight away, rather than trying to get into the mindset of research. I guess from an institutional perspective, issues like having research assistant support might be useful. Having ways that they set up their courses, maybe, whereby students can become more involved. So we have a way that we've worked in the past where we've had students work with us on their projects, on ongoing projects that we've been doing. And ultimately what that's led to is us being able to do more research during our teaching time, whilst also supervising students in a way that is kind of, it maps onto professional training. They've also been able to go on to publish. So there's employability benefits there for students as well. So again, I guess that's not an institutional policy. It's something that we've just kind of instantiated ourselves. Yeah. But if there's a way of formalizing that, then potentially there's other ways that you can build in opportunities for research support without actually impacting the workloads of other areas of university life.
And I think we've done quite well in the past in terms of really merging when we're trying to research and also when we're trying to teach or also mentor or educate project students, because when we've done that, we've made it into a learning experience which ticks that you have maybe 14 or 16 hours with a student as a project student, but also we've been able to bleed that into our research time, which has been really beneficial, I think, for both of us in terms of accelerating our research output, but also for the students, it kind of gives them a heightened experience of research because they're able to get involved with actual research projects that are being designed and carried out as you would in the field, but also it elevates their chances of getting a publication out of it, which I think is just a win-win and just maps onto employability. I think the one thing that would perhaps all benefit from around this research is if we could help smooth over the bureaucracy that takes place in universities. So when we mean that, what we mean is the kind of research support that we're giving, the administrative support that surrounds that package, how we can speed up some of the processes, and ultimately how we can, within the boundaries of ethics and everything else that we need to work with, how we can perhaps cut down some of this red tape, which really does slow us down.
Yeah, I think we said a couple of episodes ago that what we could call this podcast is why doesn't that just work? And I think that should be the mantra for higher education, or the slogan for higher education. I think it's not just research offices, it's every single department in universities. It's HR, it's research support, it's funding support, it's workloading, it's everything. I think one thing that we found in the past is that we spend a lot of our time as academics doing this administrative support, which actually is the job of other departments. But because there's so many different departments within a university, it's really difficult to get people to talk to each other, at least in a way that makes sense in terms of a timeline where everyone needs to be talking to each other. So often that gets put on the academic to do that logistical kind of pulling this department to this department and then bringing everything together. Which again is kind of it's time that shouldn't be spent by the academic, really, if we're being honest. But it's stuff that we are asked to do, and again, thinking about how you can do it in terms of your promotion prospects. Can you make that into a learning experience? Can you pull that together as evidence in terms of administrative, academic management, maybe? But yeah, that's in terms of the theme of the actual podcast, in terms of things we would change about academia. For me, I think that would be at the top in terms of the bureaucracy of universities, and thinking about how structures are set up in a way that actually, to an individual academic, so someone who hasn't maybe looked behind the curtain a little bit, can seem that like it's actively getting in your way in terms of you doing your job. And I think that for me is something that's a really big frustration. It's a frustration for a lot of people.
Sure. And it's definitely not that we kind of don't appreciate the help and the guidance, but in some instances, it's just the fact that there's not enough individuals on hand to be doing everything that needs to happen. And I think that one of the reasons that a lot of that gets pushed onto the academic is that, especially in terms of students, but this also kind of maps onto research partners and maybe charities or businesses that we work with, we are the front-facing individuals. And so whenever there's a query, it's easy to send that query to the academic because they're the person that you work with. And then we almost turn into a glorified kind of switchboard almost, where we're redirecting people and we're trying to kind of, make sure the right people are talking to the right people. And sometimes that's really difficult to achieve. Sometimes it's really easy, but I would say that a lot of the time it is kind of chasing people or us trying to find the right person who can answer this problem, and that just drastically slows down the entire system. So maybe there's some sort of education around that, maybe there's some sort of deeper level training, or we just try and fine tune the entire system, which obviously that's not our area in the slightest, so we can't really advise on that. So before we draw the episode to a close, Craig, is there anything else that you'd like to add, anything that kind of came up throughout that?
I don't think so. I think there's definitely a blog post in it, though, isn't there? In terms of the switchboard academic, I think that's that's something that, again, we had productive procrastination a couple of episodes ago. The switchboard academic could be another T-shirt that we make.
Fantastic. So guys, as always, thank you very much for listening to the podcast. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comment section if there's any other podcast episodes that you'd like to hear, any suggested topics. And until then, we'll see you in the next video.